something has shifted beneath the surface today, and you may have sensed the difference before you could put words around it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after prolonged intensity. Not the exhaustion of one dramatic event, but the quiet depletion created by carrying one emotionally charged moment into the next. For the last 2 weeks, that pressure has been building through the eclipse, the Scorpio moon, and yesterday's Venus-Saturn test, each experience adding another layer to everything you were already processing. Yet today, something finally feels as though it has somewhere to land. You might have recognized that change through something incredibly ordinary. A list of responsibilities that normally feels impossible may have suddenly looked organized and achievable. A conversation that could easily have become complicated may have remained exactly as simple as it needed to be. Or perhaps the shift was so subtle that there was no obvious event at all. Maybe you simply stopped for a moment, sat down, looked around, and realized that your mind was no longer racing toward the next problem before you had even finished dealing with the present one. That quietness matters. At 4:20 this afternoon, the sun moved out of Leo and entered Virgo, bringing one of the most demanding stretches of the astrological year toward a close and beginning a noticeably more grounded phase. Think back to what the previous 2 weeks have felt like for you. There may have been moments when everything seemed to arrive simultaneously, forcing you to confront feelings, relationships, decisions, realizations, and changes before you had enough time to fully process the previous one. If that period felt like being caught inside powerful weather that refused to settle, today's shift represents the moment when the atmosphere finally begins to clear. And this transition is especially important for 5 zodiac signs, who are moving into a genuinely different chapter as the energy changes. We are going to look at exactly who they are and what this new phase is asking them to understand, change, and build. Before we go there, take a moment and notice your own experience. What feels different today compared with yesterday? Sometimes the most meaningful shifts are not dramatic enough to announce themselves. They appear as a little more patience, a little less resistance, a little more space between an emotion and your reaction to it. If you have been following this channel through the eclipse season, this is also the point where Virgo energy begins turning everything that happened into something practical and usable. And if you have stayed present through these last 2 weeks, instead of simply allowing the intensity to carry you from one event to another, recognize what that actually means. You have been observing an entire astrological sequence with sustained awareness, and that awareness changes the way you experience a transition like this. You are not arriving at Virgo season empty-handed. You are arriving with information, emotional discoveries, difficult realizations, decisions, and experiences that can now be examined with greater clarity. The mechanics of today's change reveal why the atmosphere feels so different. Leo is a fire sign associated with visibility, courage, expression, confidence, and the willingness to occupy space without apologizing for being seen. Virgo is an earth sign, and its attention turns toward precision, usefulness, improvement, and the quiet work required to make something function properly. Leo asks you how you are willing to appear in the world. Virgo follows with a more practical question, which is how you are going to make what you created strong enough to endure. These are not competing philosophies. They are 2 stages of one process. First, you discover how you want to show up. Then you learn how to construct a life capable of supporting that version of yourself. Today's transition represents that handoff. There is another important layer to Virgo because Virgo and Gemini share the same ruling planet, Mercury. Even though Mercury expresses itself through these 2 signs in very different ways, Gemini uses Mercury through curiosity, speed, movement, questions, and the broad collection of information. Virgo uses that same planetary intelligence through examination, sorting, analysis, correction, and practical application. You can imagine Gemini as gathering all the pieces of a puzzle from different places, while Virgo sits down afterward and determines which pieces actually belong together. The instrument is the same, but the stage of the process has changed. Gemini gathers raw material. Virgo turns that material into something dependable. This is one reason Virgo season can feel so different from another. Mercury-ruled period, even though Mercury governs both signs. The difference becomes even more significant when you remember what these last 2 weeks have already placed in your hands. The Lion's Gate demanded courage and visibility. The eclipse accelerated transformation and pushed change forward faster than you might normally experience it. The Scorpio moon brought hidden truths and buried emotional material closer to the surface. Yesterday's Venus-Saturn test challenged the strength and authenticity of your relationships, asking whether what you have built with another person rests on something genuine. Each of those experiences produced something valuable. You may have discovered what you actually feel. You may have recognized what can no longer continue. You may have seen a relationship more honestly. You may have realized that a decision you kept postponing was already becoming clear inside you. But intensity alone does not create a structure for those discoveries. That is where Virgo enters. Virgo season provides the container. It is the phase in which you take what you learned and determine what can actually be used. There is also a physical seasonal connection that makes this transition even more meaningful. In much of the Northern Hemisphere, late August corresponds with the beginning of harvest season in a literal agricultural sense. Crops are reaching maturity. The result of months of growth begin becoming visible and ready to be gathered. Virgo's traditional connection with harvest is therefore not merely poetic symbolism added afterward. It reflects the physical rhythm of the season itself, the period when what has been cultivated must be collected, sorted, prepared, and transformed into something capable of providing nourishment later. That image gives us a deeper understanding of what Virgo season is asking from you now. If the last 2 weeks left you feeling divided between different responsibilities, emotions, conversations, and realizations, today's energy does not demand that you create another new feeling on top of everything else. It asks you to organize what is already present. Ancient astrologers represented Virgo as a maiden holding a sheaf of wheat during harvest, an image connected to gathering what the growing season had produced and turning it into flour bread and nourishment capable of sustaining a household through the winter. That picture reveals something essential about Virgo. This sign is often reduced to criticism, excessive analysis, or impossible standards, but beneath those stereotypes is a much more useful principle. Virgo understands that growth means very little if you never learn how to preserve, organize, and apply what you have grown. The harvest has to be gathered. The useful parts have to be separated from what is no longer necessary. What remains has to be prepared so it can sustain you. That is the deeper work beginning now. Consider everything the previous 2 weeks have placed into your metaphorical harvest. The courage associated with the lion's gate, the acceleration created by the eclipse, the honesty brought forward through the Scorpio moon, the relationship clarity revealed by yesterday's Venus-Saturn test. None of these experiences need to remain scattered memories. Virgo season gives you the opportunity to collect them, understand them, and turn them into something that can influence what happens next. That is why the quietness of today should not be mistaken for a lack of movement. Sometimes the most consequential stage of transformation begins after the dramatic part has ended, when you finally have enough silence to understand what the drama was trying to show you. Now we can turn toward the 5 signs positioned closest to this particular transition and examine the kind of growth each one is entering. Virgo, this moment belongs to you in a deeply personal way. The arrival of your season is more than simple relief from the intensity that came before it. It represents the beginning of your own new year, arriving at the same time that the collective pressure around you begins to settle. Your central lesson now is refinement, not endlessly changing yourself because you believe you are inadequate, but carefully improving what is already developing so that it can function with greater strength and consistency. There is a subtle perfectionism within Virgo energy that can become immobilizing when taken too far. You may convince yourself that something is not ready because one more detail needs to be corrected, one more adjustment needs to be made, or one more problem needs to be solved. The danger is that the desire for excellence quietly becomes a reason to postpone completion. You keep preparing for the moment when everything will finally be perfect, while that moment never arrives. This season challenges that pattern. Genuine refinement does not happen because you wait for flawless conditions. It happens because you create something, observe what works, recognize what does not, make the necessary adjustment, and then allow the process to continue. That means one of your most important acts this season may be deciding that something is finished. Ask yourself what you've been polishing long after it already became functional. What are you still adjusting, because releasing it would force you to accept that it now has to exist in the real world? Give that process a real deadline, even if the deadline is one you create for yourself. The purpose is not to make your work less meaningful. The purpose is to recognize when another round of refinement has stopped creating improvement and has started creating delay. Virgo season can become a powerful lesson in learning that something can be valuable before it is flawless. The more often you practice allowing good work to leave the workshop and enter the world, the less threatening imperfection becomes. For Pisces, today's shift arrives from the opposite side of the Virgo axis, so you experience the same transition through a different lens. Where Virgo is being asked to strengthen structure, Pisces is being invited to integrate. You have spent the previous 2 weeks moving through emotional, intuitive, and perhaps difficult inner material, and now the question becomes how to give some of that material a grounded form. Pisces naturally understands feeling, symbolism, intuition, and subtle emotional movement. Because of that sensitivity, structure can sometimes feel restrictive, as though organizing an experience might take away its emotional truth. But the lesson arriving now is not that you should become rigid or abandon the fluidity that makes your perspective unique. The deeper question is whether a small amount of structure could actually protect your intuition and help it become useful. An insight that remains entirely internal can continue circling through your mind without ever changing your circumstances. An insight given a practical form has somewhere to go. That is why one simple practice can be especially meaningful for Pisces during this season. Take one intuitive realization from the previous 2 weeks and give it one concrete expression. Do not demand that it become an enormous transformation immediately. Simply allow one thing you now understand internally to take a visible, grounded form. That is where this transition begins to reveal its deeper purpose, and it prepares us for what comes next. You do not need to transform your entire life into a perfectly ordered system for this energy to work for you, especially if you are Pisces. Begin much smaller than that. Give one inner realization a physical expression. Perhaps it becomes a piece of writing that captures what you have been feeling, a conversation where you finally say what has been sitting quietly inside you, or one intentional action that turns an intuitive knowing into something visible. The purpose is not to organize every part of yourself. It is to discover, through one small experiment, that emotion and structure can cooperate instead of fighting each other. When you live deeply through Pisces energy, fluidity can feel essential to your identity, so any form of structure may initially seem like a limitation. Yet what if structure does not have to imprison the feeling? What if it can actually give the feeling somewhere to go? That is the lesson beginning to reveal itself here. Gemini, your connection to Mercury makes this transition especially significant for you because Mercury will follow the Sun into Virgo in only a few days. Your ruling planet is moving toward the same territory the Sun has entered today, which means what you are experiencing now is less like the final destination and more like an early announcement of what is approaching. You are receiving a preview of a period that will soon become much more personally relevant to your own chart. The central growth theme for Gemini is moving from breadth toward depth. You may have spent the last several weeks moving between different interests, conversations, responsibilities, ideas, and possibilities, keeping several mental doors open at once because your natural curiosity does not like being confined to one subject for too long. That ability to explore widely is one of your greatest strengths, but Virgo season introduces a different challenge. Instead of asking what else might interest you, it asks which existing interest deserves enough attention to become something you truly understand. You may need to select 1 or 2 threads from everything you have been following, and stay with them long enough to discover what lies beneath the surface. For Gemini, narrowing attention can initially feel strangely uncomfortable because variety feels like freedom, while commitment to one direction can resemble giving something else up. But there is a form of satisfaction that only becomes available when you stay with one subject long enough to develop real mastery. Knowing a great deal about many things can be stimulating, but deeply understanding something you have chosen can create a different kind of confidence, one that does not depend on constantly finding the next interesting thing. This season is therefore not asking you to become less curious. It is asking you to let curiosity mature into concentration. If you cannot decide which direction deserves your attention, look backward instead of searching for another new idea. Notice what you have repeatedly returned to during these past weeks, even when other distractions appeared. Which subject, project, question, or interest kept finding its way back into your awareness? That recurring attraction may tell you more than the newest idea that has temporarily captured your attention. Sometimes your deeper priorities have already been communicating with you quietly long before your conscious mind is willing to admit how important they are. For Gemini, the path forward may therefore be found not in discovering something completely new, but in finally taking seriously the thing you have already been unable to stop thinking about. Capricorn, your experience of the Sun entering Virgo carries a different kind of relief, because you share the earth element with Virgo. After 2 weeks marked by considerably more emotionally intense fire and water-dominated astrology, this change may feel like the environment has finally begun speaking in a language you understand naturally. You are moving into a chapter centered on sustainable ambition. The question is no longer simply how much you can accomplish, how much pressure you can withstand, or how far you can push yourself before stopping becomes unavoidable. The deeper question is whether the way you are pursuing your goals can actually be maintained. Capricorn energy can sometimes turn endurance into identity. You may continue working through exhaustion because part of you interprets slowing down as evidence that you are losing momentum or failing to live up to your own standards. During intense periods, this can create a cycle where you sprint forward, consume your reserves, collapse, recover just enough to begin again, and then repeat the pattern. Virgo season offers a more intelligent model. Virgo understands that anything intended to function over time needs maintenance built into the system. A structure cannot remain strong simply because you keep demanding more from it. It has to be inspected, repaired, rested, and cared for. That principle applies directly to you now. If the last 2 weeks have left you operating with very little energy and reserve, this season gives you permission to rebuild, instead of pretending depletion is a temporary inconvenience that can simply be ignored. Ask yourself what your ambition would look like if urgency were removed from the equation. What if you could still pursue the same destination without treating every day as an emergency? This is the reframe Capricorn needs to practice now. Rest is not positioned against ambition. Recovery is one of the mechanisms through which long-term ambition becomes possible. If you want your goals to survive for years rather than burn brightly for a few months, restoration has to become part of the strategy. Treat recovery with the same seriousness you normally give productivity. Put it into your schedule intentionally rather than waiting until exhaustion forces you to stop. Virgo season supports this because it understands that a sustainable system is not one that produces endlessly. It is one that knows how to continue producing without destroying the foundation underneath it. Taurus, you are also naturally aligned with this earth energy, but your chapter takes a more physical and sensory direction. While Capricorn is learning how to pursue ambition without depletion, you are being guided back toward the tangible world around you. The previous 2 weeks may have pulled you more deeply into thoughts, emotional processing, internal questions, and experiences that demanded attention from the mind and the heart. Now Virgo season brings your awareness back toward the physical details that quietly determine how supported you feel each day. Your home matters. Your body matters. Your routines matter. The food you eat matters. The way you rest matters. These things can sound simple precisely because they are so close to everyday life, but their simplicity should not be mistaken for insignificance. Taurus often understands comfort through direct physical experience, and Virgo's precision can help you become more intentional about that natural strength. The goal is not excess or indulgence simply because something feels pleasant. The goal is to notice which ordinary conditions genuinely improve the quality of your daily existence, and then care for those conditions deliberately. Perhaps your living environment has been neglected while you dealt with everything else. Perhaps your body's signals have been postponed because other responsibilities appeared more urgent. Virgo season offers an opportunity to return to those basic needs without treating them as secondary. Begin with something manageable. Choose one physical area in your home that has been neglected and give it 20 minutes of focused attention today. You do not need to redesign the entire space or create an enormous project that becomes another source of pressure. Simply make one area noticeably more pleasant. That small improvement can show you how powerful focused attention becomes when it is directed towards something concrete. Virgo brings precision to your natural relationship with comfort. creating changes that are practical enough to complete and satisfying enough to feel immediately. If your sign is not among these five, that does not mean this transition passes over you. Virgo season still activates a particular house or area of your individual chart, so you may experience its influence through a different part of your life. The broader atmosphere still favors practicality, organization, discernment, and greater attention to details that may previously have been overlooked. The specific place where those qualities appear depends on your chart, but the underlying movement remains the same. Aries, your natural impulse to act quickly encounters a season that rewards preparation and thoughtful planning before movement. That tension may feel restrictive at first, yet allowing yourself to pause long enough to organize your approach can produce stronger outcomes than immediately acting on instinct. Cancer, your attention naturally turns toward the organization of home and family routines, creating a practical continuation of the emotional work you have already been moving through during these past 2 weeks. Leo, your season has just concluded, and the next stage asks you to take whatever visibility, confidence, or presence you developed and convert it into something that can endure rather than immediately chasing another moment in the spotlight. Libra, relationships come under Virgo's practical observation, making it easier to distinguish between what is genuinely functioning and what simply feels familiar or comfortable. Scorpio, after the depth and emotional excavation associated with your recent experience, Virgo offers a more structured environment for turning what surfaced into concrete changes in everyday life. Sagittarius, your instinct for the larger picture, meets Virgo's attention to small details, and when those two qualities cooperate, a broad vision can finally become a sequence of realistic steps. Aquarius, the organization of community efforts and future-oriented plans becomes more important, giving your larger ideals a better opportunity to move from abstract concepts into practical form. There is also another dimension of Virgo that deserves attention because it reveals something deeper about this season than organization and precision alone. Virgo carries a strong orientation toward service. This does not mean sacrificing yourself for everyone around you or becoming responsible for solving every person's problems. It is a quieter form of usefulness, the satisfaction that can come from contributing something tangible to another person, a community, or a cause. During this season, you may notice yourself becoming more interested in helping in practical ways. You might feel drawn toward volunteering, supporting someone who is going through a difficult experience, or simply becoming more attentive to what the people around you genuinely need. The important distinction is that Virgo's service is not supposed to come from depletion. You are not being asked to abandon your own needs so that everyone else can benefit from your energy. In fact, the healthier expression of this principle is almost the opposite. Useful service becomes more meaningful when it comes from genuine capacity rather than guilt, obligation, fear, or the need to prove that you are good enough. There is a profound psychological difference between helping because you freely have something meaningful to offer and helping because you are terrified of disappointing someone. Your body often knows the difference before your mind can explain it. One leaves you feeling connected and purposeful. The other can leave behind resentment, exhaustion, or the quiet feeling that you disappeared inside someone else's needs. Virgo season gives you unusually strong conditions for recognizing that distinction. As this new chapter unfolds, the invitation is not simply to become more organized or productive. It is to become more discerning about where your energy goes, what deserves your attention, what can be refined, what needs rest, and what kind of contribution actually comes from a healthy place. That recognition becomes the next doorway into the deeper meaning of this transition. Career and the way you move through your ordinary working life deserve particular attention during this season, because Virgo speaks directly to the systems, routines, methods, and processes that make daily professional life function. This is different from the larger ambition associated with Capricorn or the visibility and recognition often emphasized by Leo. Virgo is concerned with what happens behind the scenes, the repeated actions that may look insignificant individually but determine how smoothly your days actually unfold. That is why this period is less about suddenly abandoning your career path and more about examining the way you are already operating within it. You may discover that the biggest source of exhaustion is not necessarily the amount of work itself, but a collection of inefficient habits that have slowly become normal. Perhaps you repeatedly search for information you could organize once and access easily later. Perhaps you keep recreating the same documents, repeating the same steps, or compensating for a workflow that no longer makes sense simply because you have become accustomed to doing it that way. These small drains can remain invisible for a long time because none of them feel serious enough to demand immediate attention. Yet together, they can consume an astonishing amount of energy. Virgo season gives you permission to stop accepting those inefficiencies as permanent. During this week, choose one professional process that has recently felt unnecessarily complicated and examine it honestly. Instead of finding another temporary way to work around the problem, give yourself enough attention to improve the process itself. It could mean changing the way you organize your tasks, restructuring how you keep track of responsibilities, or finally speaking directly with a colleague about a workflow that no longer works well for either of you. None of this is particularly glamorous. There may be no dramatic announcement, no sudden recognition, and no obvious moment when everyone notices what you changed. Yet these quiet adjustments can accumulate until your everyday experience feels significantly different. That is one of Virgo's most practical strengths. Improvement does not always arrive through a major event. Sometimes it comes through removing one unnecessary step, clarifying one confusing responsibility, or creating one system that prevents the same problem from appearing again. The same principle applies to productivity itself, and this is especially important because Virgo's dedication can easily become excessive when its energy loses balance. There is a subtle trap here. You may begin with the intention of becoming more organized, then gradually interpret organization as a reason to fill every available hour with another task. Before long, refinement has turned into constant activity. That is not the highest expression of Virgo. True refinement is not measured by how much more you can force into your schedule. It is measured by how intelligently you use the time and energy you already possess. The objective is to remove unnecessary effort, not manufacture additional obligations. The objective is to create more usable space, not simply discover new ways to occupy every empty moment. If you notice that this season is producing relentless busyness instead of genuine improvement, pay attention. That may be the clearest sign that you have moved away from Virgo's wisdom and into its shadow. The same pattern of excessive self-criticism that can distort this energy can appear through overwork as well. You start believing that doing more proves your worth, when in reality, doing more may simply mean that you have never stopped long enough to ask whether everything you are doing still needs to be done. Knowing which signs experience today's transition most directly can be helpful, but the deeper message of Virgo season extends beyond individual charts. Everyone has something to organize now. The previous 2 weeks brought a very different kind of work. You were asked to feel intensely, release what could no longer remain hidden, and face truths that may have been easier to avoid. The eclipse, the Lion's Gate, the Scorpio moon, and yesterday's relationship test each contributed something to that process. But emotional intensity is not the final destination. The real value of those experiences appears when what you learned begins changing the way you live. Virgo season is the bridge between realization and application. It asks you to take what happened internally and construct something externally that can support the change. An insight can disappear if it remains only an interesting thought. A realization becomes transformative when it becomes a decision, a habit, a boundary, or repeated behavior. That is where this quieter chapter becomes so important. The excavation has already happened. Now comes the construction. There is a simple way to work consciously with this transition today. Give yourself 10 minutes and identify the single most important thing you learned or released during the previous 2 weeks. It could come from the Lion's Gate, the eclipse, the Scorpio moon, yesterday's relationship test, or any other experience that affected you most personally during this period. Do not make the answer vague. Identify the actual realization. Then pair it with one small action that could help that realization become part of your ordinary life during this week. If you discovered that a certain boundary needs to exist, identify how you will actually maintain that boundary rather than simply deciding that you should have one. If something important became clear about a relationship, determine the specific conversation that needs to happen instead of leaving the realization as an intention for some undefined future moment. If a career direction became clearer, Identify the first practical movement you can make this week, instead of allowing the idea to remain a distant possibility. This is exactly the kind of translation Virgo understands. You are taking something internal and giving it structure. You are converting understanding into routine and realization into behavior. The eclipse season brought the material to the surface. Virgo's season asks you to build something from it. There is another area where this same energy deserves attention, and that is your physical well-being and your everyday health routines. Virgo traditionally governs these practical aspects of life, yet they can easily be overlooked when discussions focus primarily on organization, work, and productivity. Think honestly about how your body has been treated during these past 2 demanding weeks. Perhaps your sleep became inconsistent. Perhaps meals became irregular. Perhaps movement disappeared because simply getting through each intense day required all the energy you had available. If that happened, this season offers a supportive opportunity to restore those basics without turning recovery into another overwhelming project. Virgo does not require a dramatic transformation. One consistent bedtime can matter. Bringing back one regular meal can matter. Taking one short walk on most days can matter. These small actions can be more sustainable than creating an ambitious health plan that becomes another source of pressure when life remains demanding. Your body carried you through the intensity of the previous 2 weeks, and it deserves the same deliberate care you might give to an important professional responsibility or an important relationship. Your physical well-being should not always be the thing that receives whatever attention remains after everything else has been handled. It deserves a place within the structure itself. There is also value in approaching this entire transition through 3 clear stages, because Virgo naturally works well with sequential processes, rather than vague demands for immediate total transformation. First, identify precisely what you learned. Avoid broad statements that sound meaningful but cannot guide behavior. Instead of saying that you need to communicate better, identify the exact behavior that needs to change, such as telling your partner directly when you feel overwhelmed, instead of silently withdrawing. Second, reduce the desired change to its smallest realistic form. Ask yourself what version could genuinely begin today, rather than imagining an ideal version that would require weeks of preparation. Third, create a specific point for checking your progress. Choose a day next week when you will look honestly at whether the small change actually happened and decide what needs adjustment. You do not have to abandon the effort simply because it was imperfect, and you do not have to force yourself into an unsustainable version of the goal simply because you started it. Name it, minimize it, check it. This sequence can be applied to almost any meaningful realization that emerged during these previous 2 weeks, regardless of which particular transit brought it forward. It is not dramatic. It does not have the emotional spectacle of an eclipse or the intensity of a major confrontation. Yet that is precisely why it can be effective. The difference between an astrological period that merely feels powerful and one that produces lasting transformation often comes down to what happens after the emotional intensity fades. If nothing changes in your daily behavior, the experience may eventually become only a memory of something that felt profound. If you build one small change into your routine, the experience begins creating a new foundation. That is the real strength of Virgo season. It turns awareness into something that can survive beyond the moment when the original realization occurred. It is equally important to understand what Virgo season is not. Virgo is often reduced to criticism, perfectionism, constant correction, or impossible standards. But those interpretations describe an imbalanced expression rather than the highest purpose of this energy. At its best, Virgo is concerned with meaningful improvement. It observes carefully because it wants things to function better, not because it wants to condemn everything that is imperfect. There is an enormous difference between noticing that something needs adjustment and deciding that the person responsible for it is fundamentally defective. If unusually harsh self-criticism begins appearing during this season, recognize that distinction immediately. The healthier Virgo response sounds specific. This particular part is not working yet, and this is what could help. The shadow response becomes global and personal. I am not working. I am fundamentally inadequate. I always fail. Nothing I do is good enough. One statement identifies a problem. The other turns a problem into a verdict about your entire worth. If you notice yourself slipping into the second pattern, gently return to the first. You are allowed to improve something without condemning yourself for the fact that it needs improvement. You are allowed to be unfinished without interpreting unfinished as failure. That balance between discernment and compassion is one of the most important lessons available during this season. Looking slightly ahead, the practical emphasis will deepen when Mercury follows the Sun into Virgo on the 25th. Then, on the 28th, a partial lunar eclipse arrives in Pisces, bringing the final eclipse of a rare cycle that has been unfolding since March of 2025. That event closes an extended chapter along the Virgo-Pisces axis before the nodes move fully into new territory for the next 18 months. Mercury's movement into Virgo on the 25th deserves attention because it intensifies the practical and detail-oriented direction that begins with today's solar shift. The Sun entering Virgo changes the general atmosphere, while Mercury entering Virgo places additional emphasis on communication, thinking, information, and precise decision-making. Conversations may naturally become more exact. Details may become harder to ignore. Communication may feel less expansive and more focused than it did during Leo season. This can be useful for situations that require careful attention, including important conversations, contracts that need review, or detailed plans that need to be completed properly. The period between today and the 25th can therefore feel like a gradual transition into this more precise mindset, while the days following Mercury's arrival may bring an even stronger emphasis on careful communication and detailed work. The partial lunar eclipse on the 28th carries a different purpose. Today's transition is about organizing and building from what you have learned. That eclipse will turn your attention toward release, emotional catharsis, and the completion of something that has been gradually reaching its natural ending throughout this entire extended cycle. The movement from one event to the next, therefore, continues the same larger process, but each stage asks something different from you. The clarity arriving with Virgo today is not separate from what comes next. It is part of the preparation. Over these coming days, the more organized and grounded atmosphere gives you a steadier place from which to face the release that is approaching, so that when the next major threshold arrives, you are not meeting it from the same scattered state that may have defined the previous 2 weeks. This stretch of the calendar has been unusually significant, with one astrological event continually feeding into the next, and each one carrying its own distinct demand. The Lion's Gate called for courage. The eclipse pushed acceleration. The Scorpio moon brought honesty to the surface. Yesterday's Venus-Saturn test demanded reckoning. Today turns toward organization. Then, in 6 days, the final eclipse of this extended cycle asks for release, bringing closure to a chapter that actually began in March of last year. Long before this particularly intense period of August unfolded, seen from that larger perspective, these past 2 weeks were not an isolated burst of astrological activity. They were one concentrated section of a much longer process, and if you have remained consciously engaged through all of it, something important has been developing within you, even if you have never consciously named it. You have been practicing the ability to remain aware while circumstances, emotions, relationships, and inner perceptions are changing around you. You have been learning to observe what is happening instead of automatically becoming consumed by it. That capacity is not insignificant. It is actually very close to the kind of refinement Virgo represents, because refinement requires attention. It requires noticing what is happening accurately enough to understand what should remain, what needs adjustment, and what has already served its purpose. Before moving too quickly into the relief of today, give yourself a moment to recognize what the intensity itself gave you. It can be tempting, once pressure decreases, to look only toward the next chapter and forget what the previous one required from you. But there is value in stopping long enough to acknowledge the courage you found during the Lion's Gate, the honesty that emerged under the Scorpio moon, and the clarity that came through yesterday's relationship test. Those experiences may not have felt comfortable while you were living through them, but discomfort does not cancel growth. Sometimes growth feels precisely like being forced to see something you had been postponing, admit something you had been minimizing, or release a response pattern that no longer fits who you are becoming. Virgo season offers the perfect atmosphere for recognizing those changes without dramatizing them. You do not have to turn every realization into another emotional event. You can simply acknowledge it. This matters psychologically because recognized growth is easier to preserve than growth that remains unconscious. When you deliberately identify what has changed within you, you give your mind a clearer reference point for carrying that change forward. Otherwise, when the emotional intensity fades, it can become surprisingly easy to return to old habits simply because they are familiar. Appreciation therefore becomes more than a pleasant closing thought. It becomes a way of reinforcing what you have actually learned. Take a moment today and identify at least one specific way you are different from the person you were 2 weeks ago, before the Lion's Gate began this remarkable sequence. Do not make the answer abstract. Think about the way you respond, the way you communicate, the way you see a relationship, the way you handle uncertainty, or the way you understand yourself. Find the difference that is real enough to recognize in your ordinary life. Then notice what today's transition feels like for you. You can share which of the 5 signs discussed today felt closest to your own experience, or if you belong to one of the other 7 signs, describe what changed for you as the sun entered Virgo. These personal observations matter because astrology becomes most meaningful when it connects with lived experience rather than remaining only an abstract system of planetary positions. And before you rush back into everything waiting for you today, notice your body for a moment. Put aside the explanations, the symbolism, and everything you have heard about the sky, and simply observe your physical state. Perhaps your shoulders feel a little less tense than they did several days ago. Perhaps your breathing feels slightly easier. Perhaps there is a subtle sense that your nervous system no longer has to remain on alert for the next emotionally demanding development. These small bodily signals can sometimes communicate a transition more clearly than intellectual understanding ever can. After prolonged intensity, settling can feel almost unfamiliar. You may have become so accustomed to anticipating the next thing that calm initially feels like emptiness rather than relief. Let yourself notice the difference. If following astrology in a way that connects the movement of the sky with practical daily life has been meaningful for you, stay connected for the coverage of the lunar eclipse arriving on the 28th. If today's quieter atmosphere reflects what you have actually been feeling, share that experience with someone else who may still be carrying the pressure of eclipse season and needs permission to stop pushing for a moment. The point is not to escape everything that happened. The point is to create enough space to organize it. That is the opportunity available now. There is one final image that captures the entire transition. Imagine the previous 2 weeks as a storm that moved through your life. The storm was intense, disruptive, and at times difficult. But it also revealed things that might have remained hidden under calmer conditions. Today is what happens after the storm passes. The air becomes quieter. The ground is no longer being shaken by the same force. And because the weather has cleared, you can finally see what was scattered, what survived, what needs repair, and what can be rebuilt differently. A storm can reveal weaknesses in a structure, but it cannot construct the stronger structure that comes afterward. That requires a different kind of energy. It requires patience, attention, repetition, and practical decisions. That is the quieter work Virgo season now places in your hands. The coming weeks are not asking you to recreate the emotional intensity of the previous 2 weeks. They are asking you to take what that intensity revealed and make it useful. Let the calmer atmosphere help you sort through what remains. Let your routines become more intentional. Let your decisions become more precise. Let the realizations you gained become visible through what you actually do rather than remaining memories of something that once felt profound. The chaos has begun to settle, and that does not mean nothing is happening. It means the responsibility is changing. The sky has stirred the material. Now you have the opportunity to decide what deserves to remain, what needs to be released, and what deserves to be built with greater care. Whatever you choose to create from this calmer ground, give it the attention required to make it strong. That is the deeper promise of Virgo's arrival today.